Hello and welcome to another 3D ROS tutorial. In today's video we're going to be going over variables, what they are, what kind of variables you might want to use, how you can use them, as well as some use case examples. Also stick around to the end of the video where I'll show you how to set up a basic teleportation system. First things first, what exactly is a variable? Well, you can think of a variable as a container that stores information. This information can be anything from a number to a string of text, or even something more complex like an object, mesh, or another blueprint actor. So in Unreal Engine it's quite straightforward to create variables, especially with blueprints. For this example I'm just going to use the basic third person character controller. So I'm just using the third person example template. You can use first person or whatever project and set up. But I've just loaded Unreal Engine and I've just loaded the third person example. And I'm just going to go to third person, blueprints, and the third person character here. And we open this up. I'm just going to pull this tab here so we can full screen it. And this is our blueprint view here. So you don't need to pay attention to this at the moment, so don't worry about that. But simple interface is scroll in and out with the mouse wheel, and you use right mouse button and drag to pan, and left mouse button to select, or hold it down and drag select to drag select. So to start off with, our variables are found here in this left corner down here. If you don't see this, you can go to Windows and make sure My Blueprints tab is turned on and just dock it wherever you would like it. So to add a variable, we just can press the plus icon here, and you can name it whatever you would like. So I just call this first variable. So now let's talk about the different types of variables you can use. If we open this drop down list here, we can see loads of different ones. We got boolean, byte, integer, integer 64, float, name, string, text, vector, rotation, transform, and then we have others under interfaces, structures, etc. But the main ones that you'd want to know, like the basic ones for starting off with, are normally booleans, which is true or false, and then we have integer, which is a whole number, like 1, 2, 3, 4, -5, -3, 20. Then we have a float, which is a decimal number, so 3.14 minus 0.25, that kind of thing. And then we have a string, which is just text. So string is different from text because, as it says here, text can be localized. So if I write name in our project settings, we can translate that name, the word name, to the correct word for whatever language we're localizing for. Whereas a string is just a string of characters, just like that. And you just want to know transform, which is the location, rotation, and scale of an object. To use a variable in Unreal Engine, you can just left click and drag into this event graph here and let go. And then we can get our variable, so we're getting the information, or we can set it to something different. So if you get, then we can check what this value is here. So I'm just going to delete that for now, and we shall move on to some examples. So for our first example, I'm just going to create a boolean, which is going to call it r_pressed, and you see why I'm calling it that in a moment. So our value for our boolean will show up here, but we need to compile the graph first to see that. So I'm just going to hit compile and save. And now you can see we have a tick box. So this represents our boolean if it's true or false. So no tick in the box means it's false. Left click adds a tick to the box, which means it's true. So I'm just going to keep the default value off for now. So unless we set it to anything different, it's going to be false. Just going to compile and save that to make sure that's done. So now what we could do to test these things is I'm going to do a key press. So right click on our event graph and I'm going to type in r key press. Just type in R key and scroll down until we see the R key. So we've got all the different keys you can press here. You can add what you want, but I'm just going to start off with the R key. So I found it here, so I'm just going to left click that, and it's give us this node here. So nodes are just blocks of code to talk to each other, and you string them together to create your final code in Blueprints. So what this node does is when we press the R key, so pressed, it will do the code from this, and when we release the R key, it'll do the code connected to this. So what I'm going to do is when we press the R key, we're going to set this boolean to true. So I'm just going to hold left click and drag this into the graph, and I'm going to let go, and I'm going to set. And I'm going to left click drag this pressed pin to the set pin here. And when we press R, I'm going to set our R pressed to true. So I'm going to tick that. I'm just going to compile and save that. It's always good practice to compile and save your work. Now I'm going to press the T key. So I'm just going to copy this R key. So I'm going to Control Z with it selected and Control V to paste it. And then under here we can select whatever key we want. So we can type in T and we can find it, or if we just press the keyboard icon here, when it goes yellow I press the T key, it now changes that to T. So when we press T, I'm going to check if we've already pressed the R key. So this might seem like a strange example, but if you're in the middle of reloading, so when you press R, we set reloading to true, which means that if you try and shoot, so if you try and press left click, it won't let you shoot because we're currently reloading. And then when we're finished reloading, we set the is reloading to false. So that's kind of the real world example, but I'm just trying to show an easy use case scenario that won't require further explanation. So when we press T key, I'm going to do a branch. So I'm going to hold down B and press left click, or you can right click and type in branch and click on that. So a branch is basically, we've got this red pin here which represents a boolean, and if that boolean is true, we're going to do this code. If the boolean is false, we're going to do this code. So as we can see, it's set to true. You can uncheck it or check it here, but what we actually want to do, which is more useful, is hold left click and drag in our R pressed, and I'm going to get, and I'm going to hold left click and drag these pins together. So now if our R pressed variable is true, we're going to do this code. If it is false, we're going to do this code. So I'm just going to hook the T key pressed to the branch, and then that's going to check if our R key is pressed. So if our R key is pressed, for this example, I'm just going to print a string. So it's going to say something. Normally you'd want to set up extra code to do whatever, but I don't want to make it too complex. So if you right click and type in print string and select print string under development, what this will do is it will print this text in the top left corner of your game view. So this is normally made for debugging, just to make sure that your code's working and you can check that it's working in certain places. So if I plug this in here and this never happens, I know that this is not turning true, and that's where the issue is lying. But for this, I'm just going to show you an example of variables working in process. So if R key pressed is true, we can set it to say something like R is pressed already, and then I'm going to do another print string on false, and just as an example I'm going to create a variable, and I'm going to name this variable not pressed R key string, and I'm going to change the variable type to a string, and I'm going to compile that so that leaves our variable open to editing, and I'm just going to write what we want to display in here. So this can be used so you can update this variable and it'll update everywhere that you've got this in your graph. So if you're reusing values, you want to store it in a variable so you can call upon that later, or you can change it in one spot and it will update everywhere in your code. So that is a fundamental thing of why variables are great. So in this value here, we're going to do it for the false. So I'm just going to say R key not pressed and hit enter. And then I'm just going to left click drag that in and we can get, or we can left click drag this in and go over the pin and it says make in string equal not pressed R key string. So I'm just going to press that, and now this print string is going to display whatever this variable says. So pretty simple, right? So I'm going to do a more complicated example in a minute and we're going to get the player location and make the player teleport. But for now, I'm just going to save this. So I'm going to compile and save. So remember, if we press the R key, it sets our R press to true. If we press the T key, it will see if R is true, and depending if R is true or not, it will say something different. So I'm going to go back to the third person map and I'm just going to press play to play our game. So at first I'm just going to press the T key and this should say that we haven't pressed R yet because we haven't. So I'm going to press T and then it says R key not pressed. I'm going to press T again just to make sure nothing's changed. It says R key not pressed. Now if we press the R key and then I press the T key, it now says R is pressed already. So now that has been pressed, we've changed that variable to true. So I'm just going to hit escape to go back out of that, and I'm going to open our character blueprint again. So now that's a good example of using booleans and also a string. But now we might want to use something more complex, such as a transform. So I'm going to create a new variable, and I'm just going to call this player transform. So a transform is basically a location, but it includes the location and the rotation and scale of an object. So I'm just going to create a transform here, and I'm going to compile that to open up the variable. And if we bring down this drop down, we can see we've got location, rotation, and scale. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to copy this key press again, just so we can easily see our examples. I'm going to set it when we press Y. So when we press Y, we can, what we will do is I will get our object. So this can also be a variable, objects. So our player is an object blueprint, a cube could be an object, that kind of thing. So I'm going to go to the components tab here. Again, if you don't have this, go to window and turn components on. And you can drag this in. So you can drag any component from here into the graph, and then we can change this component. So for the collision example, we can change the collision size. But for this, I want to do self. And as you can see, we can't drag in the top part, because it is us. So to reference us, we could just reference self in the code. So if I right click and type in set transform, set actor transform, click that. Now under target, we can set these things here and we can add this target. We can't add it here because this isn't an actor. So our blueprint is an actor and everything inside of it is a component. But if we had set actor transform, we could set the transform of each particular actor and we'd plug that into target because we want to target that actor and set that actor's transform. But in this case, we want to set self, which is the default value. So this third person character, we want to set everything in here, so it's self. So when we press Y, we can set the transform of our actor. And we can set that to our player transform here. So we can get that and set it to that. So now this will set our player's location to 0, 0, 0, rotation 0, 0, 0, and set the scale to 1. But first, what's probably good is to get. So I'm going to right click and type in get actor transform, and now this will get the current transform of our actor. So if I right click and type in print string like we did earlier, I can connect the get actor transform to our print string, but as you can see it's not the same type of data, but we can convert that data. So if I pull this pin, which is a transform, so a transform is orange, and try and plug it into the string, it says convert transform to string. And basically that's converting this data into something that's text based, so we can display the transform. So when we press Y, we're going to print the actor's transform. So I'm just going to press compile and save, and now when we play the game again and I press Y, it now shows our player's transform in the top left corner. So if I move around and spam it, as you can see it's changing because we're moving around. If I stay the same, the player's transform is not changing. So now you can see that data right there. We can do something useful with that data. So what I'm going to do is set our actor transform. So what I'm going to do with that is our player transform, when we press Y, we can set the player transform. And I'm going to set it to the current transform at the time. So when we press Y, it's going to save the transform of our player, so location, rotation and scale, and it's going to save that to this variable, and we can reference that later on. So we're saving it when we press Y, and then when we press the U key, so I'm going to just copy that and paste it and press U here. When we press the U key, we're going to set our character's transform to the transform that it was when we pressed Y. So I'm going to compile and save that. So now if I move over here and I stand on this edge and press Y, that's saved our transform to that variable. And now if I move over this corner and press U, we're back to where we pressed Y. And we could do the same, so I press Y and then I press U and we teleport back to that location, because we're saving our location when we press Y, saving that in our variable, and then when we press U, we're then using that variable to set the actor's transform. So we're storing that data in the box, in the variables, and then we're calling it again at a later date and using that elsewhere. So that's the basic rundown of variables and how you can use them in a simplistic way. So we've went over booleans, we've went over string, and we've went over transform. I can give another quick example. Might take a bit longer to give a full example in the situation of a game, but if we get a variable and I just call it number1 and I set the variable type to an integer, I do number2 and that's an integer as well. We compile that and save that. I'll just set this variable to 1, this variable to 2, compile, save, and we drag in number1 get and number2 get. And we can drag off this and do an add. So we can add these two together and we get an output here. So we'll get an output of 3 because we got 1 plus 2 equals 3. So if we do another print string, just to debug what we're doing, when we press R, convert, again you can convert an integer to a string to display that. We compile and save. So now when we press R, it should display 3 in the corner up there. Now another thing to be aware of with variables is this I here. So what we can do is we can press this I, and what that does is toggle instance editable on that variable. So if I compile and save that, what that does is if I drag my player in, for example, it now shows that value here. So we can change that directly in the viewport without changing it in our code. So if we had multiple objects, so we had a wall's maximum damage to break, we could duplicate that wall and say this wall has more damage, so set that damage to 500, whereas this wall here we set to 300, and then all the code will work the same, just that health value is different for each of the objects, and that way we can just control that a lot easier inside of the editor, which is pretty cool. So yep, we've went over now booleans, strings, transforms and integers, and then of course the same will happen with a float. So we can change that, and that's when red. So I just hold Alt and left click to remove that connection, and then we can connect them together. So if I disconnect that now as well, it's doing integer plus a float, which is going to give us a float value because it's not going to be a whole number. Bless me. So the output's going to be a float, so that's why this is turned to green now. So with number 2, we can do a whole number, but we can also do a part number as well. I need to compile that first. So now we can set that at 2.5 instead of 2. So now we should get 3.5 when we press R. Whereas if we try number 1 to change that to 2.5, it will not. It just rounds down to 2 because it is not a float. But you'd want to use integers where you're always going to have whole numbers. 1, just to make sure it is a whole number, but 2, that saves a lot more processing power than a float, for example. So just use them sparingly. So I think I'm going to wrap it up for this tutorial. I will link at the end of this video a playlist of my programming basics series. A lot of it might not be out yet. I am working on it and editing a few videos, but I thought I'd get this one out for you just to explain some key fundamentals, and I hope it helps you in your game dev journey. If you found this video helpful, please do give it a like and consider subscribing. It is free, and check out my other videos that you might find helpful. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.